title of Chapter 7, Emails, Texts, Memos, and Letters, is much better than the typical term used to describe these forms of writing, which is technical correspondence. It's better because it's more concrete. You can point to an email or a letter, these are things, but you can't point to correspondence because it's a concept. Correspondence is also an outdated term. It sounds like something you'd hear in a movie from the 1950s, though it does still show up in popular culture from time to time.
You're not going to go?
No, I think I'm going to catch up on my correspondence.
What these different types of writing have in common is that they're all forms of direct communication to a specific audience. But there are important differences between them as well, most importantly in terms of use and context. As is often the case, the differences have mostly to do with questions of audience and purpose. You can probably already guess, for example, that texts and emails are usually, though not always, written to different audiences. Just like in your personal communication, text messages are usually written to people you know well or have some kind of existing relationship with. That's changing somewhat as companies are using texts for marketing purposes and also using technical writers to compose those texts. But you should still think of text messages as a more familiar form of communication, which means that you should avoid using it with audience that you aren't as familiar with. Even if you've had phone conversations with a client, vendor, or supervisor, you probably shouldn't send them a text message unless specifically asked to do so. Text should be reserved for communicating with team members or co-workers that you have a closer personal relationship with. Emails, on the other hand, are fine for any kind of audience. You can and will use emails to communicate with clients, vendors, and supervisors, and you can and will use emails to communicate with team members and close friends at work. In fact, it's hard to overstate just how common and vital email has become in most professional settings. In many jobs, you'll send and receive dozens of emails every day at work. They're so common and so frequent that if you're not careful, you can start to get a little casual about your emails. It's very important to remember that all emails are official communication, at least legally speaking. Any email you send could be forwarded to an audience you didn't intend it for. And even if it isn't, each email is preserved digitally on servers for an indefinite period of time. In other words, write all emails as if your boss, your most important client, or even that coworker that you're tempted to gossip about might be reading what you've written. Memos and letters are similarly defined by audience and purpose. Memos, as we'll talk about in a minute, are internal communications, often about company changes or policies. Letters, on the other hand, are almost always external communications. You might write a letter from your company to a client or to another organization, or you might write a letter to a company as an individual, as you did when you wrote your cover letters for your resumes. Further confusing the issue, of course, is the reality that letters are increasingly being sent electronically, which means that they're actually emails. In other words, some of the lines that we're drawing here are a little blurry. The best advice is to treat all of those forms of communications with the same level of respect. Follow the 6 C's presented in your textbook. Make sure all forms of correspondence are concise, concrete, complete, correct, courteous, and clear. Since the assignment you're working on is specifically a memo, I want to talk just a little bit more about memos and how they should be approached. As I mentioned, memos are usually written to members of the company or organization in order to communicate policies, changes, or other important information. As a result, even more than emails, memos are an official form of communication. Or I should say more than other emails, because almost all memos are now sent in email form. That means that when you send a memo electronically, you're competing against all of the other emails in the reader's inbox. And as I said, most workers receive many, many emails every day. So if your memo is important, as most memos are, you need to find ways to make sure your audience actually opens the email and reads it. You should compose your subject line carefully, for example. Be as specific as you can. A subject line like new policy or important meeting isn't very effective. Something like work from home policy changes or calendar planning meeting March 30th would be better. Definitely avoid leaving the subject line blank, or using an informal subject line like, "Hey." At the same time, be mindful of your tone, even in the subject line. If you write a subject line like, "Urgent, read immediately," your message better really be urgent because you've likely just scared your audience to death. Also be mindful about the tone and structure of your memo itself. As the textbook points out, many people read emails on their mobile devices, which often only show the first few lines of text when they're first opened. For that reason, put important information at the beginning of the memo. Don't start with a mindless, meaningless, rambling introductory paragraph that doesn't communicate any real information. In other words, don't start with the kind of introductory paragraph you probably wrote for your freshman composition classes. Instead, use your opening paragraph to state your purpose or provide the key point of information that you're communicating. One exception here, which is really about being aware of tone. If your memo is communicating bad news, like layoffs or salary reductions, you probably want to cushion that news by starting with something a little more positive, maybe a general statement of support or a reinforcement of the organization's values. Then use the middle paragraphs to provide details or to explain the information more fully. You're going to have to work out the balance between completeness and conciseness in this section. You don't want to leave out any necessary information, but you also don't want to go on and on with unnecessary explanations or details. Generally speaking, memos should be no more than a page or so in length, never more than 2 pages, I think. And often this middle section will be just one paragraph. But if you need to make more than one point or cover more than one idea, feel free to have multiple paragraphs here. Your final paragraph should give clear directions to your reader. What do you want them to do now? What should they do if they have any questions about the information you provided? Throughout the entire memo, but maybe especially in the closing paragraph, you need to think hard about the tone you're trying to convey. Read your words aloud and think about them from the reader's perspective. How might your readers interpret the tone of your writing? Always be courteous, but make sure that the tone matches the content of the memo. If you're delivering bad news or discussing a very serious situation, don't be light or flippant. Never be sarcastic or snarky in a memo. Be direct, be serious, be sensitive to your reader's concerns. And finally, always proofread your memo carefully. You're not just proofreading for mistakes, though you should definitely proofread for mistakes, but also for tone and content. The more important the information in your memo is, the more important it is to get that information right and to communicate it in an effective, reader-centered way. Let me know if you have any questions.